Well, we know that the nation's towns and cities are on the front lines when it comes to solving some of these problems, whether the president or Congresswoman McMorris Rodgers spoke about them, whether they're economic or social. But throughout this election year, we're going to be looking at what works on the ground level. And tonight we're joined by 4 mayors from around the country. 2 Democrats, Marilyn Strickland of Tacoma, Washington, and Pedro Segarra of Hartford, Connecticut, plus 2 Republicans, Scott Smith of Mesa, Arizona. He also is the chair of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and Mayor Mick Cornett of Oklahoma City. We welcome all of you to our special coverage. Let me start with you, Mayor Cornett, Oklahoma City. I think you're the longest serving of these 4 mayors. What did you make of the President's State of the Union?
Well, he told a lot of people what they were looking to hear. I still think this president doesn't understand the huge deficit that this nation is facing. When he took office, the nation had a $10 trillion deficit. It's now 17. And today he said that he had cut the deficit in half. And that seems like some sort of crazy math to me. He introduced a lot of new programs tonight that got a lot of applause, but I don't see how that's going to reduce the debt. His policies have been in place now for 5 years, and for the most part, they're not worsening. Inequality is a big problem in this country, and as he said tonight, inequality has only deepened. I did like his approach to infrastructure. We do need to spend money on infrastructure in this country. I think that's an investment that the president and I can get together on.
Mayor Strickland in Tacoma, Washington, I wondered what your first response was, not only to what you heard the president say, but the response as well, the Republican response.
No, I think that the president did a fantastic job of outlining the agenda moving forward. He talked about opportunity, he talked about action, and he talked about optimism. And those are really the principles that this country is founded on. And I think it's really important for us to understand that, this wasn't an easy thing for him to have to talk about some of these issues that are important to all of us. But he got reelected during a time when we had a deep recession that we're crawling out of. So I think the fact that he talked about raising the minimum wage and also talked about the importance of having access to health care. The health care plan isn't perfect, but in Washington State alone, more than 320,000 people now have access to health care. And having access to it is a difference between going to a hospital and getting help or possibly going bankrupt. So I think he did a really good job of explaining what can happen in this second term.
Mayor Smith of Mesa, Arizona, what was your takeaway from the president's remarks? He mentioned working with mayors in a few instances, one on the minimum wage.
Well, mayors work with the federal government a lot and every day because we work with federal departments. On minimum wage, to me it's interesting. There's no doubt that we all want people to prosper. We want them to get out of poverty. But it seems like the emphasis on minimum wage means we're going for the minimum as opposed to working on high-quality jobs, on high-paying jobs. And that's what mayors really want to do in our community. It's great to lift people, but you lift people by expanding the economy, by creating high-quality jobs, not by focusing on minimum wage jobs.
Mayor Pedro Segarra of Hartford, Connecticut, you come from an urban area which has many, many challenges. And did you feel like the president touched on that? He talked a little bit about things having to happen outside of Washington, or at least outside of Congress. But did anything he say speak to the concerns that you deal with front burner every day?
Absolutely. As a city that experiences a high rate of poverty in one of the most affluent areas in the United States, it's definitely relevant. Investments on things that can really be a life changer, a game changer for the people who are poor and the people who can now, perhaps by working with the federal agencies, can have a better path towards the opportunities. Investments in early childhood education, investments in pathways and jobs by really focusing more and working with the federal agencies to try to coordinate. Everything that we do around collaborative impact, and I think that by strategizing with our state and our federal partners in a time where congressional action is lacking is probably one of the best ways that we can achieve something under the current situation. So I think it was very relevant. I think that trying to work with the federal agencies, anything from gun efforts, the Department of Justice, working with the Department of Education on trying to better access programs of education is definitely relevant to creating those ladders of opportunity that the president spoke about.
Mayor Cornett of Oklahoma City, how do you see opportunities for mayors officials at the city level, the local level, to work with the federal government?
Actually, I think President Obama's administration has been quite friendly to city officials. A lot of them came out of the city of Chicago, and they'd seen very powerful mayors, but a city government that gets to work. And I think we've had a pretty good relationship with them. The problem has been largely on the administration side, and just the growing number of policies that the president keeps enacting that aren't necessarily helping our country go forward. I'd like to see some immigration policies come out of this Congress and White House. And I was also interested tonight to hear the president talk about that MyRA, that retirement system that could come out and help a lot of people. That might have some merit as well. I'm anxious to see the details on that.
Mayor Smith is head of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Often when the mayors come to Washington, it's to ask for federal help. Is this one of those cases now where you've given up on Washington the way so many Americans are and you're not asking for that help? Or could you still use it?
I think it's a misnomer that mayors just come to ask for help. What we want is a partnership. We want to build our economies. We recognize that cities are the drivers of the nation's economy. Well over 80% of the GDP in this country is created in cities, and mayors get things done. But we do so by partnering with our local businesses and our to build our economy. I thought, going back to the minimum wage, one thing was really interesting. The president talked about minimum wage, but the two best examples he used of minimum wage, for example, were those businesses that did it voluntarily, both the pizza parlor and then Costco. And we believe that we should lift our people, but we just don't want the federal government to mandate that. We want them to be partners. We want them to do what we do on the city level, which is to work with each other, but let the private sector and individuals lift themselves, as opposed to government somehow forcing that on them.
Mayor Marilyn Strickland of Tacoma, Washington, what about that question of the minimum wage?
Well, I think that, there are two ways to look at this. I think for some people, they're saying that this is just focusing on the bottom, but there are people who have entry-level jobs that are minimum wage, and if minimum wage have kept up with the cost of inflation, it would be somewhere around $17 an hour now, and it isn't. I think another thing I like to bring up about the mayoral aspect of working with the administration, we've been very, very lucky to have access to the administration. And 2 years ago at one of our leadership retreats, we talked about 3 priorities for Congress and the administration: comprehensive immigration reform, passage of the Marketplace Fairness Act, and also investment in infrastructure. And as mayors, we said we wanted to do this because we want to focus on jobs. We know that those 3 things can be job creators. And at the end of the day, it's a thriving middle class with the power to spend that helps businesses. The best thing we can do for business is to give them consumers with spending power.
Can I ask you, Mayor Segarra, also about the big issue roiling here in Washington, and that's health care. How does that trickle down or trickle up from the local level, especially in Hartford, where you're trying to deal with people who have so many other concerns in the air, on their plate, including health care costs and health care coverage?
Well, absolutely, and I think that the fact that we as a state have had the highest enrollment rate of any of the states show how critical that issue is to our community and to our state. The fact that also health impacts the ability of many of our children and our families to be able to also succeed. So I think that the issue of health care is one that has been very prominent on our state agenda. The governor has been pushing for the exchange, and thanks to him and some other partners, we've been able to get a high enrollment rate, and that's something that is critical, especially because the health care issues are related to poverty.
We want to thank all 4 of you mayors for joining us. It's been so important to get the perspective from you and from your cities. Thank you very much for staying with us.